Peter, I have been watching this president closely, as have you, for more than 3 years. I've been watching him particularly closely over the last 3 weeks. His performance is, by the admission of his own allies, uneven and halting. And it really has been revealed some of the price that he has paid for telling 16,000 lies and counting. He would very much like to command the respect and attention of the broader general public. He would very much like to do and say things that soothe and calm the markets. He does not have those tools in his tool belt at this point in his presidency.
Yeah, I think, we're seeing a crisis of the kind he hasn't faced before, one that's a whole lot more challenging to him. It's an invisible killer. It's not a human target that he can, he can tweet at or mock or even use military action against. And I think that works against his sort of most natural skill set. He's at his strongest when he has an opponent, an enemy, somebody he can joust with, whether it be a Joe Biden or a Hillary Clinton or a Barack Obama or a James Comey or a Adam Schiff. That's what he knows how to do. He knows how to do that. He's usually been pretty successful at that, at least within his own goal set. But this is a very different challenge. I was with him the last 4 days in Florida. We went to Atlanta to see the tour that CDC, went to Tennessee, and we were on the plane just yesterday coming back, where the crisis really kind of came into the plane itself. One of the congressmen he was bringing back, it turns out, had been told he had been exposed to somebody who had been infected and self-quarantined on the plane. Watching this plane, as we came back to Washington yesterday, was stunningly familiar to anybody who was on that plane during Katrina, which I was in 2005. Watching the television set with the news flashes, the sinking Dow, the cruise ship making its way toward Oakland, the increasing number of schools that were closing, and you felt as you were flying back to Washington like you were flying back to a whole different world, one that was really going to test this president and how he was going to respond the way other presidents have been tested in the past. That's
unbelievable imagery, and you're right. And I mean, it brings to mind, and I'm not saying that the crises are similar, but a day of crisis for a president, obviously the president I worked for and that you cover, George Bush, flying around on 9/11, where the president and the plane himself becomes the story in this case. And I was following your Twitter feed all day as all of these Republicans in the president's very close and rather small inner circle were revealed to have been in contact with the infected patient who was at the CPAC conference. Mark Meadows is another one, the incoming chief of staff. What's the status today of his self-quarantine?
Yeah, Mark Meadows just picked on Friday by the president to replace Mick Mulvaney as the chief of staff of the White House, the person he is entrusting the rest of his presidency, the rest of this term at least, and to help him get into re-election, turns out to be self-quarantined. He's only going to be self-quarantined until tomorrow, as I understand it, because that will be the end of the 14-day period from the time he would have been exposed to the person who was infected at the CPAC conference, the Conservative Political Action Conference in Maryland. He's tested negative for coronavirus, so he's not sick himself. He's just staying away from people for another day in an abundance of caution. But I think it tells you something. It tells you that this is a wider spreading kind of situation than the president himself wanted to admit. It was not that long ago. He was in the briefing room and he told us, look, just 15 people in America have this. That wasn't even a correct number then. It's certainly not a correct number now. And I think that he's had a hard time finding the balance between reassurance, which you do need to do as a president in a crisis situation, underplaying or seeming not to take as seriously as some people would like him to take a crisis that is now affecting everyday people across this country, where their schools are closed, their conventions are canceled, their travel has been restricted. This is something that goes beyond anything he has faced in his 3 years as president.
Karine, any White House fears an incompetence narrative, because once it sets in, the public and your political adversaries can always find examples to prove it's true. The federal government is massive. There are always examples. It seems that is now locked in with the delay in testing, with the mixed messages. Rachel Maddow had on her show part of a phone briefing from the head of the CDC that I listened to. And Donald Trump is still at a step in terms of the substance, and maybe it's a matter of emphasis of his message, with the message coming from the nation's top scientists.
But Donald Trump doesn't care, right? He lies about the small stuff. He lies about the big things. And he's been lying since day one of his administration, when he lied about crowd size. And like you said, he's lied 16,000 times since he's taken office. And we knew we were going to get to this moment where a crisis would happen and he would have no credibility. And you have a president right now who is misleading the public, lying to the public, and, you know, Biden is right. Biden said in that interview with Lawrence O'Donnell that he should just be quiet, and he should, and let the experts deal with it. Let the scientists deal with it. That's who we need to be dealing with or hearing from, because the president lies, and he has no credibility at this time.
You know, David Jolly, I said this last night, and I really believe it's true. If Donald Trump were capable of fading to black, of just going, of shutting off the, and I say this in all seriousness, if he could shut off his Twitter and go to one of his golf clubs, Bedminster or Mar-a-Lago, and say nothing for 2 weeks, I bet his approval ratings would go up 10 points.
Yeah, sometimes leadership means not getting out in front of a story, but simply reassuring the American people. I think we're all wondering if we're living through the week where this is the turning point, right? Mm-hmm. The market saw the turning point last week into yesterday. Our American families now seeing the turning point. And what the country's asking for is a president who can calm not just the markets, but calm their fears. Mm-hmm. You know, Bill Clinton built part of his political narrative by saying, I feel your pain. Mm-hmm. Donald Trump is asking the nation to feel his. And it is a weird leadership quality in a moment of crisis. And to use the Katrina analogy, I know you and Eddie had this conversation, his comments that there are only 15 cases, there will soon be 0, are akin to Bush 43 saying Brownie's doing a great job. It was that moment where he can't take it back. And whether it's incompetence or not, what Donald Trump doesn't realize in this moment is the American people are fearful. And he is not providing leadership. In fact, he's asking for people to accept his grievance, that he's not getting a fair shake. And what is different than Katrina, very different, and I'll just say it, is Fox News. The reality that the American people have bought into a masterful line by Donald Trump, that the hysteria is actually the media's fault and the Democrats' fault. They believe that now. You have to give credit politically to Donald Trump as president, but what it means for a public health crisis should be concerning for not just every American, but for the world. That you perhaps have one of the leading nations of the world whose leader in Donald Trump is going to exacerbate a national a healthcare crisis for his own political benefit.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.